What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. And boy, do we have a special episode for you today. My guest is somebody I absolutely love, and we've never met technically, but in part, it's because he reminds me of a version of myself that I lost a long time ago and that I've only started recovering in the last couple years. He's a journalist, a public intellectual, arguably a historian now that with his next book, which we'll get to. If I had to characterize him, I would say he's some kind of like mashup or a keeper of the flame for like Edward Said and Mike Davis. And I'm being completely honest. Like there's a handful of serious and original radical thinkers in the millennial generation. We're both millennials. And not only is he one of them, but he's the only one to make sense of the millennial experience as something that's downstream of political economy and class forces, right? So you can find his writing all over the place, and his words, when you read them, they're not pablum or like punditry bullshit. It's powerful stuff. And his first book, which is a lot of what we'll talk about today, it's called Kids These Days, The Making of Millennials. During the first year of the pandemic, he also had another book called Shit is Fucked Up and Other Bullshit. That's the real title. And it's a title that kind of proves he's a spiritual kin with this show. And then early next year, I think, around the same time as my next book comes out, he's got this magnum opus with a beautiful cover, I might add, called Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World, which I hope we can talk about today. But the guy I'm talking about, sitting here with me virtually, is none other than Malcolm Harris. What's going on, man?
Nothing much. Thanks so much for having me, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So to situate your writing in relation to you, when did you go to high school? You know, your rough age range. Where did you grow up? Like, what's that early origin for you?
I don't have the luxury of a rough range because they put my birth date on the first book. That was like a requirement of the publication, was that they'd say born in 1988 on the cover. So I'm whatever that is now, 32. 32?
Okay, so like a sweet spot millennial. So I'm elder millennial. You're like
Right in the
right
middle of
there in the
that.
meat. What is the
Yeah.
early? What's the early bound? Like 80, 82, something like that?
So there's no strict definition. There's no body of standards that decides the generational lines. The closest you get is maybe like the Associated Press doing polling or whatever. So I use 1980 because it's a round number and it's close enough.
Yeah, fair enough. So where did you grow up?
So I was born in Santa Cruz, California, but I spent years 8 to 18 in Palo Alto, which is part of why the book is set there.
So like Stanford loomed large in your imagination, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, more
in a critical way or in an
more than my
aspirational way.
reality of my imagination. Even I didn't even think about it that sort of way. I mean, my high school was on Stanford campus. It's literally across the street.
Oh wow, geez. Okay, so when did you start becoming politically conscious? For me, like hip hop was an entry point for me into politics, but it was very distant from my personal experience growing up. It was slightly before the war on terror popped off, just because of my age, and so I have a background that like finds a lot of like sympathy with hip hop, but it wasn't a direct personal experience that led me to like be political. So like what was it for you? Where was that experience shaping you? Was there any like activism as part of that too?
Yeah, I mean, my earliest political memory in terms of like being engaged with the world while politics was happening was probably the 2000 election, which happens right before my 12th birthday, I guess. So I remember like watching that happening and thinking like, oh, this is bad. And then it was 9/11. So then it was
Yeah.
the invasion of Afghanistan. That was the first time that I got politically involved. Was going to march against the invasion of Afghanistan, and then continually through the anti-war movement, which in the Bay was pretty well developed, if not particularly effectual,
Mhm.
as a young person, as like a adolescent and then teenager. So it was the anti-war movement was really my like first political home.
Okay. Were your parents politically active, or were you sort of neutral suburban kind of life?
No, more active than that. I mean, they took us to marches when we were young kids. Uh, my dad volunteered for housing activists in East Palo Alto, and my mom did like the Women in Black, if you remember those, the women who would pass out like anti-imperialist tracts on the street, like
Yeah.
anti-war tracts in the early 2000s. So they were like involved, but not like I wasn't a red diaper baby or whatever.
Yeah. It's weird because I had a lot of these same like anti-war experiences, but I happened to be like a soldier of empire at that point, just because of where I was in my life. I was like I made my career within the sort of burgeoning national security state,
Mm.
um, and I'm like paying penance for that now. But so I read somewhere that you were pretty active in the Occupy movement. Was there? And so I'm very curious about this in like a number of ways. One, the bridge from the anti-war movement to Occupy, like was there a bridge, or was it, the anti-war protests died down and then there was nothing and then Occupy sprang up? Like, can you situate us in how you were experiencing all that? The Occupy was like the first anti-capitalist populism in the 21st century for America. Like before that, there wasn't that much, like WTO
Mm.
protests, maybe.
Yeah, well, and as a sort of a previous sequence, right? The alter globalization movement at the end of the
Yeah.
20th century, I guess. And this was definitely a different thing for me. The hinge between them was the student movement. So I go into the University of Maryland in 2007.
Okay.
University of Maryland College Park. So if you're part of the university or the national security apparatus, then you know that University of Maryland is like a pretty important part of that complex.
Yeah,
Uh,
I was there in 2007.
Really? Oh, well, there you go. We
Yeah,
might
yeah,
walk by each other on the quad. You never know.
I know.
Um, so at Maryland, I got involved with SDS, which was a new network modeled on the old left wing college student movement. And mostly what we were organized around at the beginning was still anti war stuff, especially in DC. I don't
Hmm.
know if you remember any of the Funk the War protests or stuff like that. And DC had a very left wing chapter within SDS, which was very like multi tendency. Um, but SDS in DC was really like sort of anarchist, ultra left, and Maryland was kind of an outshoot of the DC chapter. Um, and we started organized around anti-war stuff, and then as the financial crisis hit, which happens in 2008, obviously,
Yeah.
um, and we are starting a struggle, and schools nationwide are starting to struggle around tuition hikes. Um, the focus, the work changes a little bit, and as well as there's a tactical change that starts going on and a strategic political change that's going on at the same time, led by students out of the UCs as well as in Puerto Rico, and some in New York as well.
UC is like University of California
Yeah,
system.
University of
Yeah.
California system. Uh, and so I had a lot of friends at the UC system, particularly my friend Max Fox, who's still a close comrade and fellow writer type, who are part of that struggle. And there's a lot of like very interesting intellectual work coming out of that were the precursors to Occupy stuff. So Occupy starts as kind of a student movement against
Hmm.
tuition hikes and against student indebtedness. And so Maryland's movement around this work was not as well developed as it was in New York or in Berkeley or Davis, or Santa Cruz for that matter. But we had a little offshoot. We were part of that same current that was looking at occupations, and we had a school occupation, and there were school occupations at schools across the country, from people who were looking at this strategy and tactic and thinking about occupations and taking over spaces and prefiguring space instead of trying to reform systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so I graduated in 2010, and moved to New York pretty soon after. And so pretty soon after that, there's the start of Occupy Wall Street, and I was at the first meeting in August 2011, the first General Assembly down by the Bull, and the rest is
So
history.
it was incidental that you were there because you happened to be living in New York.
Yeah, well, I had moved to New York to work on this project called The New Inquiry, which is a magazine that was starting.
Oh yeah.
So that was a pretty big thing. And Max, who was my friend who I was talking about earlier, would moved because his brother lived in New York, and so he could crash on his couch while he found a job. And a lot of people had moved to New York because that's where work was, right? There were a lot of young people who had moved there. And I knew a lot of people from the national SDS network that I'd met through conferences and such.
Mm-hmm.
So when you got to that first meeting in August 2011, there were a lot of people there that I knew and who I'd worked with and that we could trust each other. Where I knew their politics and they knew mine because we had met at some conference or some tour or whatever during the student movement.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I haven't studied Occupy formally, but like the way it sits in my imagination is that it was just this sort of organic upsurge, and then something Dave Graeber, and then and then it sort of goes away when the police come in and fucking crush it violently.
There's some truth to that.
Yeah.
Every part of that has some truth, but there's also other stories. There are always other stories.
Yeah, it's just interesting that there was like a genuine social network that sort of predated it that happened to be there.
One political network, not even just social network, but
it
comes out of this student movement and where people had developed their politics and developed their critique and developed their understanding of financialized capitalism and how it was working.
This is interesting. So this actually is a good segue because way back in the day, possibly, I don't have the date, but like around the Occupy time, you published a piece in N+1 on student debt. And I was going to ask sort of what was the intellectual wellspring for that, but it sounds like it was your ferment within SDS and the Occupy movement. Is that about right?
Well, not even about right. It's very direct. And so it comes out of a teach-in that me and some other people researched basically during the financial crisis. So we're part of SDS in 2008, and we're working on an anti-tuition hike campaign, trying to avert a tuition hike at the University of Maryland. And when the financial crisis hits, our immediate thought is, okay, how do we work this into our critique, right? How do we explain what's going on to people in a way that links it back to the campaign that we have going on right now around tuition hikes? So how do we connect housing debt to student debt? Well, first of all, we have to go find out what actually is happening. So we did this really intense research project trying to figure out what was going on in the financial crisis and what was back security and how everything was collapsing and subprime loans, and be able to explain it to other people. And so very quickly we started stamping up these flyers saying, what the fuck is going on? Come to this room at this time for explanation about the financial crisis. And that was probably the most successful event we did in my 3 years in Maryland, was this teaching about the financial crisis, because we packed this room full of students who were not leftists, who just wanted to know what was going on.
Yeah, what the fuck is going on? That was a genuine, deep feeling at the time.
Especially for people who were about to graduate into a job market that they assumed was going to be pretty okay, and to watch the economy collapse and think oh God, am I going to have a job? And so we packed this room full of, business students, whatever. And we were the first people on the ground with an analysis, right? We were the ones who can say we're going to tell you what's actually going on. And we
Big
were able to
advantage.
link it to student debt and connect it to student loan asset-backed securities, right? Because it's a very familiar structure, right? When you look at the structure, they're actually much closer than we even expected in the first place.
Yeah.
And so it's out of that research that the student debt piece comes. And it's crazy thinking that then student debt wasn't really thought of in these terms. And the claim that like actually student debt is bad, and like the way that we're paying for school is bad was like a new take, right? That was like an N+1 take, was like the student debt system is not good.
That's what was remarkable. Like that was what stood out to the about the piece to me, because certainly like that's kind of become a conventional wisdom now, especially
Mm-hmm.
among our cohort. But like you go back 10, 12 years, student debt is it's an investment in yourself. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like that that's quite a like flip of the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, it's. I mean, 2008 was a flip of the actual situation, right? So
Yeah.
it's the conventional wisdom, and you know, when people ask me about, oh, does the fact that the student debt system is all fucked up mean that I shouldn't go to college? And my answer is always no. That if you actually look at the numbers, the best thing that you can do for your earning potential is still to get more education or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a worse deal doesn't mean it's not the best deal on offer still. Um, so it's hard. It doesn't translate into like, you know, self-help advice.
Yeah, I think we'll probably get into this, but there's that tension between like what's the individual logical incentives versus the logic of the system itself, you know. um, okay, so I had a mechanical question about this too, separate from sort of like where'd your knowledge base on this come from? You wrote a piece at a major sort of left-wing publication, N+1, and you're like newly out of college, I guess, at this point, or maybe you're still in it. But like
I was
that's a
graduating.
big okay, so that's a big jump though, regardless. Like that's a milestone or an achievement. Did you just write it cold based on what you guys were doing in the teach-in and the trying to get the diagnosis right of the financial crisis? And then so you like wrote it in a cathartic sense, or somebody N+1 contacted you? Like how did that happen in a procedural way?
Okay, I can go into the specifics because it's worth. I guess people do wonder about these things. How do do you know
How
somebody,
do you
whatever?
do it? Yeah.
And especially because the networks can be so opaque, and that people tend to assume, right, that you like have some particular connection or whatever. So the way it happened for me was I had gotten involved with the New Inquiry because I'd been writing a blog because this was the high age of blogs.
Blog era, yeah.
When I graduated, I got a part-time job with a site called shareable.net, writing content for them. And that was at the time when it was believed that Web 2.0 was a progressive influence. So this is where like couch surfing and Uber were like one thing. It was like, we're going to use less stuff because we're going to share. And that's what the sharing
Yeah.
economy is all
Sharing
about.
economy. Yeah.
And so I did sort of like left wing stuff for them. It was a cool like gig, but it was not particularly secure. But it also let me do sort of whatever I want. It's an internet job. So I had that, and then was looking for stuff to do, and was writing my own blog because that's what, if you were a left wing thinker at the time or fancied yourself one, you had a blog. And I ran into the New Inquiry, which is this startup publication in New York. Online, and thought like, oh, this sort of looks like my speed or whatever. Let me see if I can get involved here. And then I did send a cold submission just on their submission email, being like, hey, this is me. Here's a thing I wrote about the IKEA catalog. Here's the link to my blog. Like, let me see what you think. And they really liked it. And I met with the editor, Rachel Rosenfeld, who happened to be out in the Bay where I was, back staying with my
Yeah.
mom. And she was like, you need to move to New York and come work on this full time. Come, like, you can rent my closet sized extra room for $400 a month till you find another place, which was an amazing offer at the time, and come
Yeah.
edit this publication. which was, you know, really the dream if you were a would-be writer out of college, whatever, especially if you went to Maryland and didn't have the like New York area connections, which I really didn't.
Yeah.
So I was doing that work at that time already. So I was like a, you know, new kid on the scene or whatever. I was writing stuff for New Inquiry, which was starting to get noticed. But that came out of a tweet, which was, I read a piece that Bruce Robbins wrote for N+1 about Negri, about Hart and Negri's
Antonio, yeah.
Commonwealth.
Empire.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's the third. So he wrote a review of the third one that was sort of like, oh, this is silly. Like all this multitude stuff is still like goofy or whatever. And this was at the time they published it basically like while the Egyptian Revolution was kicking off. This was pre-Occupy, but like stuff was still really going on. And I sort of tweeted like, what a ridiculous time to publish this article, given what's actually happening in the world. How out of touch can you be?
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, they like messaged me or whatever. And I was like, yeah, write a letter to the editor. So I wrote a letter to the editor and they published that in N+1 being like, Bruce Robbins is wrong. Actually, this is clearly happening, you know, insofar, you know, parts of what Hart and Negri are describing, because I had read Commonwealth and I knew the book and I knew their argument. Yeah. And it was informing the way I was thinking about politics at the time, pre-Occupy. So I wrote that, and then when I wrote the letter to the editor, and I think I was talking to, I think it was Keith Gesson over there, said, oh, and if you guys want an essay about student debt, you know, let me know. I'll write one for it. I got one in me about why student debt's actually bad. And I think they like sort of forgot about it, and I like hit them up again, being like, hey, do you still want this essay? You know, I'll write it for nothing, basically. I think I did write it for nothing, $100.
Yeah, basically.
But yeah, I eventually got it published, and then it did really well. Surprisingly, it like went viral, and
it was a big piece,
and people read it, which was very. It didn't work exactly the way it works now. I think like if it had been now, it would have sort of fucked up my life because I probably would have like written a book that I wasn't prepared to write.
Or like a book narrowly about student debt or something.
Yeah, like it could have been like, you know. And I like met with an agent or two, but I wasn't really like ready to do anything, and I didn't get swept up in it enough.
Yeah.
I also sort of fucked up and failed to like translate that into like a essay for a publication that would pay me or some like into anything really.
Or
but
IP
it was really exciting.
For a movie.
I know, right? Like I didn't even like establish myself as the expert or whatever.
Yes, I'm the student debt guru.
I know, right? So, which I'm not really comfortable. I'm like, that's not really like me anyway. So it was really exciting to like get that analysis out, especially having like done it in the student activism place in the first place.
Yeah, that's a fascinating. I'm glad I probed you on that because that's a really interesting backstory. And
now
it was
it's on
like,
the record.
Yeah, we got it on wax now. The thing that I mean, like when I was saying before, like I don't have like a strict definition of what a public intellectual is, but it sure as shit is not this packaged branding thing that we were both just alluding to. And like I could see from your own just like Google stalking you and like what you've written that you have some themes that you work with, but you jump around based on like what's important and what's urgent and like what is worthy of your attention. You're not just milking a fucking you're not just milking the paycheck and building that brand, right? Like that's what you could have done with the student debt thing. If you were, I don't know, like the Puff Daddy of public intellectualism or something. Like
people were very like, especially during the Occupy time, people were very like on the lookout for that kind of stuff. And it's funny that it's that now though it's the left intellectual world is so much bigger, and you actually have room for people who are sort of puffy brand people who get a bunch of attention and make a bunch of money and don't say very much stuff. But then it was really like anyone who stuck their head up, it was like, oh, you're trying to sell out. You're trying to like make money on this. So there was a lot of, it's funny that you're like, oh, I heard you were involved in Occupy, because at the time there were a lot of people being like, oh, you're just like, you're selling Occupy, you're packaging Occupy for sale.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
That's kind
So
of a Gen X energy, though, isn't it? Like
well,
we never
maybe
really
we
had
could
a
use
chance
a
to
little bit
sell
more
out.
of it,
Like,
right? Maybe we could use
yeah,
some of it back.
interesting. Okay, so this is uh, a good point for kids these days. The first book about the millennials. So every single book I've ever seen about millennials, it sucks. Like it's flaccid straw men. Kind of seems like the books are always trying to catch that publishing wave of like what's hot to publish about, you know? Like they're thin on argumentation, and kids these days is nothing like that. It's the opposite of all of that. And so, as a starting point, like what is the origin story of this book? But like how do you decide to do this? How does it come together? Is an agent pushing you to do it? Are you riding the wave of student debt and you're looking out and being like, what's important next? Or how do I make this bigger? Like what's your thinking here?
No, I mean it sort of came out of the long read of that student debt piece, because I started the book a long time ago, and it was
Mm-hmm.
a small publisher approached me about writing a book sort of to do with it, and the more I was like thinking about the issue, the more the question expanded from student debt narrowly to like a critique of student debt, to like what is student debt doing, why does it exist, and what is its role in the economy. And
But so you were thinking about this before Occupy and before the student debt piece?
yeah, I've been thinking about it, but not the book itself. The book itself
Okay.
came like later. I think I wrote it 2014, 2015.
Okay.
And I wrote it originally for a small publisher, that then when I turned it in, they were like, we don't know about all this or whatever. But it was the draft was very close to what I ended up publishing, and so I felt really good about it, even though it wasn't like a narrow student debt kind of thing, even though it wasn't like conventionally reported or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was an important idea to get out, but I was really sensitive about the ideas of like selling out or whatever, so I didn't want to get an agent. And so there were a couple years there where I pulled it from the original publisher and then just sort of sat on it and then tried to like pitch it myself to some smaller publishers,
Oh wow.
and couldn't get bites. People were, editors would be interested, and then public bosses would decide that it wasn't a good fit or whatever. I couldn't move it, and I got really demoralized and
Hmm.
uh, was close to just like giving up on the manuscript. And so then I was like, all right, well, I should at least like talk to some agents. So I talked to
Mm-hmm.
my like friends who I knew in the writing world, and I think I sent like 3 emails, and 2 people were like, one person didn't respond. One person was like, I'm not really interested in the topic, like didn't want to read the manuscript that I had.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third, who ended up being my agent, was like, oh yeah, I remember you wrote that thing for N+1. Let me read the thing, and read it and said, oh, this is a book, we can publish this. And then like a couple months later, I had a low 6-figure offer from Little Brown to publish my book, and all the same people who didn't want to give me the time of day when I was trying to peddle it to their door myself,
Yeah.
now we're like, oh, sorry, we can't afford you. So it was a little bit of a wake up call, and again, certainly an education about selling out versus selling. Period.
Yeah. 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 The fact of selling is not the same as selling out. I see selling out as something that's like more intellectually vapid, not about whether you make money or not. Um, but yeah, that's it. Only takes one to change the whole narrative. Like you had to eat shit for a little while. um, that's fascinating. So
Well, if I knew what I
you
was
had a
doing, I would have
draft
been more methodical. So if I
as
knew
it.
what I was doing, I would have approached a whole bunch of agents. And if I had like known the right people and gone about it the right way and wasn't sort of just like going at it myself, I would have done it much better earlier. But you live and you learn, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Okay, so you are, acutely aware more than most, I guess, that like generations as a thing is to some degree like a marketing scheme for selling stuff to like boomers and Gen X, or primarily Gen X. Like your whole book is this argument about what makes millennials a distinctly identifiable generation. And it's really not just about consumer tastes, not even primarily. So
No.
so your argument is about political economy and the culture that develops under, like capitalism or neoliberalism. So can you talk a bit about what it is that comprises the sort of shared plights and attributes of millennials? Like what makes millennials distinct?
Yeah, well, and I don't, for the record, I don't use the word neoliberal one time in the book.
I noticed that.
And it was funny
But
because you
that's
still have reviewers who are complaining, like, "Oh, he still talks about neoliberalism." I'm like, I didn't talk about neoliberalism.
but
Um,
I think it's, for the record, I think it's fair to. It's just that, like, as long as you're being specific about how you're using it, that, like, it describes a real condition. It's just that it's also a capacious term.
yeah, it refers to so many different things at the same
Yeah.
time. If you're talking like the situation in the capital relation, or if you're talking about the global politics, if you're talking about the intellectual movement. So
Yeah.
there's a lot going on. So it's not one that I like usually use. But if you look at the back cover of my book, it has this graph. I got them to put, instead of a bunch of words, to put this graph where you see productivity and wages diverge. So these lines are going up together until late 70s or early 80s, and then they split, and compensation just levels off and productivity keeps increasing. And so if you think about that as a historical occurrence that then is shaping a cohort of people, right? If you use cohort, people take it more seriously than generation, because generation is a much like nicer marketing term. So if you say
Yeah.
cohorts, that's more academic, and people, oh no, you're not trying to sell something, basically.
It's very serious.
Right. Which, I don't mind signaling that, right? If you're like, you're right that generations are used in these marketing ways that are total bullshit. So that's not the way I'm using it. I'm talking about a birth cohort of people who come of age during these real shifts in relation between labor and capital, and are shaped by that. And you think about human capital as something that's produced, and laborers as a thing that's produced over that time. And so that's what I was trying to understand with this book, is if you think about this cohort of workers, which is ultimately what you are, right? What this cohort is mostly made up of is workers. If you think about the production of this cohort of workers, how have they changed according to capital's needs from their workers? And so that's what I was trying to think about millennials in terms of, because I think it explains so much of what we've seen, and really explains now in the years since political divergences that people did not expect at the time.
Yeah, I mean, the ability to see millennials as this cohort of workers that is constrained and structured in certain ways, like, you can't see that if you're swimming in the ocean of, I'm going to say it, neoliberalism, right? Or just like, you can't, I if you go back 10 years, you just, like, capitalism is so taken for granted that you don't talk about capitalism. Like, the ism is not part of your analysis. Like, your analysis is within it. And so you have a perspective from being on the left, I think, that made this book, I mean, obviously possible. But yeah, like, I think that's like the core of what makes this book so radically different from every other book that like invokes the name of millennials.
Well, there are a couple
Yeah.
other ones I want to like get on the record, that I'm not the only one who's got a like political economic understanding of millennials. That like Keir Milburn, who are Generation Left, is it UK guys? Really good. It's a slim book, but it's really thoughtful. Sean Scott wrote a book that's like the more from a cultural angle, but from a political economic angle, about the culture of millennials in terms of the labor relation. So there's some other people. It's not just me. I'm not the only one who thought of it. But it's true that most of the stuff you get is marketing speak one way or the other. There's more money in it.
Yeah. I mean, certainly not. Yeah, political economic explanations are not generally mainstream, or at least they didn't used to be. Maybe they are now.
More and more, I think
Yeah.
we're moving in some sort of war of position, making absolute gains, if not relative gains.
Yeah. So I like that reference. The, the book puts forward a lot of data to support the idea that millennials are spending more time working than previous generations, and some of this is because there's no separation between the personal and the professional. Some of it's technological, right? But you say, quote, millennials' extra work hasn't earned them the promised higher standard of living. By every metric, this generation is the most educated in American history, yet worse off economically than their parents, grandparents, and even great grandparents. End quote. So, like, how do you make sense of that phenomenon? Like, what do you make of the claim that, like, some people say that, like, millennials don't have anything to complain about because, yeah, they're eating shit now, but as soon as the olds die off, the millennials are going to inherit all of that hoarded wealth. Like, tell us how to think about this.
I mean, if you're like counting chickens in 2022 about your inheritance, I think you're insane. Like, yeah, you better hope their house isn't somewhere that's gonna burn or get flooded, or you hope that
Yeah.
the healthcare system doesn't eat up every inch of their savings, juicing them while they die, or they're
Yeah.
like people counting on money that they don't have. I don't know. I'm not from that tradition.
Yeah.
But there is that sense that, like, oh, but when you're 60, maybe your mom will die and you'll inherit her house or something, which is
Mm-hmm.
not the same as like you enjoying a higher standard of living as predicted by like the Keynesian attitude of life will get better for every generation. Uh, and at the time this book was published, and even when it was written, which was a couple years before that, the idea really was that you earn a higher standard of living through education, and that you go
Mm-hmm.
to school, and that to the degree you go to school, you'll be better off. And even if society might resent you to some degree for being a snooty, overeducated, whatever, the idea was still you get paid. You go to school, you get paid, and that's what the whole generation was told for a very long time. And
Mm-hmm.
so the idea that there's a divergence between those, that people can get more and more educated and yet get paid worse, throws that into question. But when you think about it from you don't even need a Marxist standpoint to think that, like, oh, when the supply of educated workers goes up past the demand,
Yeah.
eventually the wages are going to go
Fucking
down.
obviously, right?
It's
Like,
not
what?
like it's not that complicated. Like, you don't need the whole like Capital Volume 1 to 3 to get
Superstructure
through
and shit.
that
Yeah.
line, right? Like, but people were really sold a bill of goods about the more educated you get, the better the economy will get, the more good jobs we'll get,
Mm-hmm.
post-industrial, whatever. Robots will do everything for us. Maybe there'll be a guaranteed minimum income, etc. All this shit turned out to be not true at all.
Mm-hmm.
And now most people have no problem putting the connection between the two, understanding that just because more people go to school doesn't mean they're going to be richer.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay, so you make a strong case that thinking of ourselves, this is very related to what you just said, thinking of ourselves as human capital is kind of a scam, for lack of a better word, right? It keeps a really unfair economy going. But you kind of hinted at the beginning of us talking too that, well, you're not going to not go to university. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you have to build your own individual like skills and knowledge base to optimize yourself for this economy. But that's obviously like you have to. Do you agree that you basically have to hustle, but that there's just like that creates like system level problems, and that it benefits corporations more than it does you? Like, how do we think about this human capital thing? Because you're like very
Yeah,
down on it, and like it rightly so, I suppose. But like, what do we do? How do we think about this?
great question. And I'm hoping to write a lot more on this question
Oh,
in
good.
future projects, because I think it's
Yeah.
very important and hugely under analyzed. Like,
Hmm.
human capital does not have a Marxist definition. No one has worked out within Marxist typologies what human capital actually refers to, how you can integrate it into the production circuit. in terms of the equations and how it's set up. Like, no one's done that work. And I think it's actually worth doing, in that there are answers. Right now, we're working with neoliberal definitions of human capital, right? Like Gary Becker, and these are neoliberal economists who are trying to value everything, who will put a value on people as workers. But so from a Marxist perspective, when you talk about capital, I'm not talking about capital, human capital, in a Bourdieu sort of way, where it means like clout,
like symbolic
symbolic capital. And there's some really good writing about this recently, about a critique of what's called the extension model, where everything is turned into a form of capital, right? Like, you can have baseball capital, and if you know the most about baseball, you have more baseball capital than someone else, and like, people credit what you think. Like, you can call anything turn anything into a hierarchy and then call that capital. But that has nothing to do with Marx, and has nothing to do with the production of value, and the like analysis of capital. And Bourdieu doesn't even pretend like it does. So the conflation of these ideas has been really problematic. Because when you think about human capital in terms of a Marxist terms, it's not something a laborer can have. You can't have human capital as a worker, because you're a worker. You are defined by your lack of capital.
You're not an owner of
capitalist. So who owns human capital? Well, in the liberal states, you're not allowed to own human capital per se, individual human capitals. You have been in the past. And there's some really important work on that we still, I don't think, have dealt with sufficiently, about the production of human capital under slavery, and under chattel slavery.
Got my water. Sorry, 1 second.
Sure.
But in terms of human capital today, when we talk about a worker's human capital and should I go to college or not, we're talking about how an employer is looking at a worker during the production process, right? How a worker appeals to their employer during production is what human capital is. Human capital doesn't do me any good, except insofar as I can get a job. And then when I'm at that job, my human capital doesn't do me any good except insofar as I can get my boss to pay me for my work. So what I'm doing to receive value and to produce value is work. I don't have any capital. All I can do with my skills or abilities to benefit me is to try and negotiate better working conditions with my boss, the owner of capital, on behalf of myself, a laborer, right? So that's not capital in terms of it's something that I can own and sell on a market, or leverage to produce things through other people's labor. All I can do is work. How human capital appears, and its origin, is really the perspective of the state, right? You're thinking about your national human capital, and you're thinking about it in terms of international competition, right? So
production capacity and stuff.
Yeah, right. You're thinking about it in terms of militarily, basically. Specifically, you're thinking about it versus the Soviet Union, and you're thinking about it in terms of science and technology. And so, you don't care if your individual scholars are going to make a bunch of money or whatever. That's not relevant to the state necessarily, at least when they're working on human capital at the beginning. They're thinking about, are we going to be able to have enough guys who know enough about computer chips to make bombs that are accurate enough that we can scare the shit out of the other guys? And so that's where human capital comes from, right?
That's a good way to situate it,
One version of human capital comes from. And so when you think about like, oh, I need to produce my human capital, we're thinking about that in terms of the privatized state, right? Where the job to produce the national human capital has been dispersed to individuals and firms. So now we say the best way to produce the national human capital isn't for the state to send everybody to college and to run basically a state industrial program out of the Pentagon, where we do DARPA and all that. The best way to do it is to set up an economy that pays gajillions of dollars to whoever invents the best doohickey, or whoever convinces Wall Street that they invented the best doohickey, or whatever. And then it's up to individuals to produce it for themselves, right? So we've increased the cost of education. So you need to think about it in terms of your own value, producing your own value to the system, as opposed to the system thinking about how to integrate your value into its own arsenal. So there's a lot to be written and thought about, but yeah, it's important for people to understand that like you don't have human capital, you are human capital.
Yeah, it's like you want to be cognizant that you're playing in something of a rigged game that's very inherently unfavorable to you as a worker, but there isn't, at this point, there's not really an opt-out. So like,
Well, again,
unless you can organize on like,
which is why it should be understood as work, because it's the same thing as work, right?
Mhm.
It's absolutely, you alienate yourself every minute you go to work. Every minute you go, this is the immiseration thesis, right?
Yeah.
Is that every minute you go to work, you're not only subjecting yourself to exploitation, you're strengthening the system that continues to exploit you and that's going to exploit you tomorrow. Every minute you work, you're advancing the boss who tomorrow is going to grind you down a little bit more. And yet your social position compels you to work. That is the position of the worker, right? Is that you're compelled to strengthen a system that oppresses you. And it's the same thing for human capital. And so you think about students as workers, right? As people who are producing human capital on behalf of their future employers who are going to put it to work. They're compelled to alienate themselves, to alienate their labor. And that's something that was sort of always apparent to me as a young person in school who didn't like school and who felt like I was there not for myself, but for someone else. And trying to figure out, well, if I'm not here for me, who am I here for? Why am I doing these exercises?
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of which, at one point in the book, you say that, quote, millennials represent the demographic territory where a serious confrontation has already begun, a battle to see if America's tiny elite will maintain the social control they require to balance on their perch, end quote. And the narrative you paint in the book does not represent anything like a conspiracy, but you really push hard on the question of like cui bono, right? Like who benefits, who's gaining from this obviously shit arrangement from the perspective of most workers and by definition almost all millennials. And so like I guess the question would be, do you think America's ruling class or its oligarchic billionaire class, do they need millennials to be this atomized 24/7 hustling, anxiety-ridden, economically insecure cohort? Or like does it have to be that? Did they need that in order to function, or is it just that they take advantage of it, or that they design the system this way? Like, how do you think about this?
Yeah, I guess I don't think about it in terms of predatory intention, although individually that's of course there all the time.
Yeah,
You can find it all over the place, but I don't think that's the crucial ingredient.
You don't need a designer for this to be a bad
No.
outcome. Yeah.
Well, and that's the beauty of the system to these people, right? And that's why some people think of it as like a holy system almost, is that it is uncontrollable. I've been reading this guy, this Hungarian thinker, István Mészáros, and he talks a lot about the uncontrollability of capital. That one of the main features of capital is that you can't control it, nobody can control it, and that it acts without regard for personal intention. And I think we're really seeing that I think if you ask almost there are some real sickos out there, but you ask almost anyone who's benefiting from the system of like, do you want to stop global warming or whatever? It's like, do you want this not to happen? Do you want these things to not be going this way? Do you want to like stop COVID or not have a monkeypox infestation? Or, you can ask lots of people like, do you want it not to be going this way? Or like, couldn't you do with a little bit less if, even your own grandchildren could be doing with a little bit more or whatever? And they'd say yes. Like it's not a result of individual poor choices, and yet there's no mechanism through which they can exercise that kind of control over the system, it seems.
Yeah, that's trouble. But yeah, they're not going to vote against their interest. You can't expect them to vote against their interests, I guess. And their interests are certainly on the side of having millennials be like chronically precarious like this, which means these non-economic things are like an adjunct to that or like downstream of that, like the being drugged up and ADHD and like all these things that we associate with millennials.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly true. As for I'm not a economic determinist when it comes to people's voting, right? Because I don't think that even matches up with the data. People act all sorts of ways when you get to individuals and even when you get to sort of demographics. And I think there's a lot of money in driving people nuts. And I think an electoral system that's based on raising people's hands one day every couple of years is subject to some really obvious abuses. And I think people vote against their interests and realize the next day that they voted against their interests, or don't realize till a year later that they voted against their interests. And so,
yeah, the thing I would carve out an exception for like oligarchs though. Like,
but the oligarchs are split. I mean, half the oligarchs vote Democrat. Republicans will tell you that right away, right? It's like when you get up there.
But that's because Democrats serve oligarchic interests.
Well, that's
not to.
Like, but you're talking about, if we're talking about voting as the question here, then I mean,
yeah, that's
not tied, and maybe that's the answer, right? That it's just doesn't have a relevant answer to class division, and it's not divided that way, and so there's no way to vote your interest because your interests aren't represented.
Yes, there's no amount of voting harder that's going to make the situation for workers necessarily better. Oh yeah, okay. So, I wanted to talk quickly about circle back to the student debt thing, or an aspect of it. You had a whole chapter talking about college as a debt trap. Like, it's obviously too expensive and getting worse. It saddles students with like long-term debt. Most degrees are like thinly connected to the job market. And in that context, you talk about this dude named Bob Meister.
Mm-hmm.
Could you share like a vignette of this? Because I thought it was like a really powerful short story and I had not heard it before.
Well, so this is part of Bob Meister is a wonderful professor. Actually taught a class that my dad was in back at UC Santa Cruz.
Oh, wow. That's funny.
Yeah. Awesome professor from everything I've heard, and great writer, and was supportive of the student occupation movement, and was not just in terms of, I'll sign your whatever, but in terms of producing research that supported their work and their goals. And so what he wrote, one of the things he wrote, and I think it was for Monthly Review, which is a wonderful, august left-wing publication, was about the way that the regions had financialized student debt and the promises of future tuition increases in order to provide the bonds, in order to finance the bonds to build more construction projects. And that this was a huge critique of the UC occupation movement, of the student occupation movement at the time, and at Maryland as well, which if you've been to Maryland, they built a lot of stuff a lot of time. And this was at the time when they just built the new business school, which is very shiny.
Yes, of course.
And so this was a like real precise critique and an unveiling of really what was going on behind the scenes of the university. And these kinds of critiques have become much more common, I think, as a result of the 10 years of struggle, is that people understand now that universities are, real estate companies or hedge funds with some classrooms attached. It was really revelatory for him to go through and say, like, this is how they pledged your tuition to Wall Street, which I think is the title of the piece. That they said, we're going to raise tuition, so don't worry, we'll be able to pay back these bonds to build these buildings because we'll just suck it out of the kids. And I think that was very powerful.
Yeah, it's awful. And so like you get everybody gets a shiny business school now. Everybody gets a rock climbing wall, but students get much heavier debt burdens as a result of this. And it's not clear that the rock climbing wall improves your education, but who knows?
But it does improve the competitiveness of the school as a destination for rich students, which improves your selectivity, which really improves your position among your peers if you're the president of the university, right? So building a rock climbing wall is a really good idea if you're the president of the school looking to move up in the world, and they're all looking to move up in the world.
That's right. Who's not? You gotta do what's necessary in order to get the best IG photo. Okay, so in your arguments in this book, like your explanation of millennials, it relies on situating millennials within economic trends. And in that context, you talk about the concept of polarization, but not like in the Ezra Klein sort of like political
Yeah.
polarization way, but like polarization of the workforce. Can you explain what you mean by that, or what the research means by that?
Yeah, and I think I talk about Arnie Kallenberg a lot. Kallenberg.
Yeah.
He's got a book called "Good Jobs, Bad Jobs." I think is the book title. God, it's been so long since I worked on this book.
Yeah.
I'm trying to like now remember my research.
Quizzing you on a 5-year-old book. Yeah.
I think that's the one on polarization that's really good. That looks at this divergence within the labor force during millennials' lifetimes. Right. So obviously we're not composing the workforce in 1982, but it's still the conditions under which we're born and raised, where you have this emptying out of these middle class union production manufacturing jobs and the divergence in job quality from managerial and professional roles, which go one way, to service, and you have employment polarization. So you've got more workers going into service jobs that are less productive and can't offer the same sort of productivity raises over time. And so you have this polarization of the workforce into these good jobs and bad jobs, as opposed to more people in middle jobs.
And even the good jobs are insecure in a way. Yeah. I mean, like,
Well, and
it's
so the polarization narrative is sort of incomplete, right? Because that's written in sort of an earlier period, and then you see the crunch on people with more education that's happened more recently as workers. And so it's important to see polarization as a condition under which workers were produced, where you've got human capital trying to end up on the right side of this division of workers. But I think it's a mistake to think like, oh, there's one group of workers who got to go sit in the clouds with the capitalists, and there's another group of workers who got stamped down to go work at Walmart or deliver packages. That's an incomplete understanding of what actually happened. And hopefully my new book will lend more clarity on that one.
Yes, I hope so. The Harry Braverman had this classic book. I think it's called Labor and Monopoly Capital. I say it's classic, and then I'm like not sure about the title. But his argument was about the professional managerial class, PMC, like how even, or it wasn't about them, but even the PMC, like high income white collar workers, are subject to de-skilling pressures, right? So they even those people who are supposed to be like capitalist disciplinaries are economically insecure. And that seems to me like the basis for some kind of cross-class unity in principle. And Gabe Winant has made an argument along those lines, I think. But there was like two questions here. One, how do you think about PMC relative to workers, and like, is there an alliance there? Because like, I want to say yes, but thinking through like feasibility and stuff is very difficult. Two, much bigger question: Are we? How would you characterize the state of our political economy? Like, are we in a neoliberal era? Are we in a precarity capitalism that's post neoliberal, which is like a recent argument? Or there's people on the fringe left and the far right who think we're like neo feudal now or techno feudal. Like, how would you characterize the system that we're in against?
They'll do those. Okay, I'll try and go one to the other because they're all very.
I can ask again. Yeah.
So on Braverman, I think Labor and Monopoly Capital is a classic, great book and part of the same monthly review tradition that I think is really important. But I think Paul Adler's got this really interesting critique about the de-skilling idea, where he actually argues that jobs haven't gotten easier and that sort of de-skilling was an illusion, and that like just because you're sitting at a computer doesn't mean you're going to have fewer workplace injuries. And so he's looking through and he's saying like, oh, you think like sitting at a computer and typing keys de-skills a job, but it's not very different in terms of the injury rates, or it's actually the injury rates are higher than you would have had on these other ones. So he's got this real, I think, sharp critique of this idea of de-skilling that we're going to have to reckon with if we're going to figure out what the deal with human capital is.
Mm-hmm.
Because over time, you can't really have a de-skilling if you have a model of human capital, right? Because we've been building human capital and we've had huge increases.
Yeah, it goes in the opposite direction.
Right.
Yeah.
So you need to have some understanding of what this relation is between skilling and human capital.
Yeah.
And so Adler has a different way of phrasing what like skilling and labor conditions look like in the age of the computer. And he's writing this like I think in the 80s. And he's in the 90s. It's very interesting because he's not a Marxist, and he's trying to rescue Marx from what he thinks of as insufficiently rigorous Marxists. So he's saying like the issue with it isn't that you're being de-skilled, it's that you're being increasingly exploited. And so that even as your skills go up, your payment for your skills can go down. And so if you measure skills in terms of, and so he's thinking about it in terms of absolute and relative surplus value. Really interesting stuff. So there's some interesting critiques of Braverman and skilling.
This is good.
I haven't worked through all of it yet, but I think it's important questions with regard to human capital. In terms of the PMC, I mean, Barbara Ehrenreich, who comes up with the term along with her husband,
John, yeah.
has no. We can leave the husbands unnamed sometimes, you know.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's okay.
She concludes that, and she writes like during the Occupy sequence that the PMC is dissolved. That like insofar as you could, that she saw them as a like divergent class fragment from the working class. Any of those distinctions have practically dissolved. And so it's interesting that then the PMC discourse takes up way after that. And there's a whole like, pamphlet that they produce that I think it's like Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in New York produces a whole pamphlet like with Ehrenreich about what was the PMC sort of situation. And that people haven't really turned to that to explain what was going on, when I think it actually has a lot of answers. So PMC is one of those like neoliberal that I try not to use too much because I think it's more freighted than it is useful in terms of the discourse right now. But I will say that they're professional managerial class workers still, and that you can't think of them as members of the capitalist class in any sort of real way. And when you think about like, oh, well, they're workers who receive benefits from the capitalist class based on their work strengthening the capitalist class, that defines every worker.
That's all workers, yeah.
so the question is like, oh, we draw the line at here, or and I think Marx says at some point, it's like, maybe if you make as much as like 8 average workers, maybe you could be like a little capitalist or whatever. And it's like, that's usually not what we're talking about when you're talking about PMCs or whatever. I don't think I worry it's a not so rigorously used terminology. We need to think, and I think Gabe does a good job thinking rigorously in terms of class formation, which is what we're ultimately talking about.
So when we talk about across class unity, you can bracket off the question about PMC terminology, but the idea that like technocrats and white collar high skilled workers, like a management class, a management cohort or whatever, like that they're still workers, and therefore it's almost organic that like there should be some sort of alliance with working class workers.
I mean, there's not an alliance, but I mean, to think about the class terms, I tried to get into this a little bit with my review in New York Magazine of the book Class Matrix.
Vivek Chiburzia.
Is that you can't assume there's a one-to-one relation between class framed analytically and class framed subjectively and politically. Like there's not an alliance within the working class for the working class. Like never mind an alliance between different class fragments. Like insofar there's a working class movement, it's really checkered, and it definitely includes lots of, writers, if that's who we're talking about when we're talking about PMCs or whatever. Fewer, anesthesiologists, if that's who we're talking about. But we're not usually talking anesthesiologists, and then we actually have to think about the medical industry and how classes form within the medical industry. So
these categories do not act collectively as categories.
Yeah, and it becomes really silly, and say we're obviously not all working class people support working class politics. Like that's the number one. Like police officers exist.
Yes, that's why we're in this mess.
Like our police professional managerial class, like I don't know, they make six figures and can fucking tell you what to do. Like they tell the mayor what to do. Like I don't know, man. Like, but I do want to get to the question of what do I call the system, because I think it's an interesting one, and I think I don't use the ones that most people are using these days.
It's pretty high stakes because the diagnosis is the basis on which you propose either remedies or strategies or whatever. And so there's a lot invested in these different characterizations of the system. So I'm very curious.
So I've been thinking about it in terms of, for me, it's just capitalism. First off, it's capitalism. We're not in feudalism, techno-feudalism, neo, post, whatever. It's capitalism. And if we want to think about it in terms of traditions of modification that I find useful, I've been thinking about financial monopoly capitalism lately, which is how Paul Sweezy, once he sort of reconciles with the thought of Rudolf Hilferding, adjusts monopoly capital to be financial monopoly capital. And I think this is a very, very useful formulation, partly because of how well it addresses imperialism and the history of imperialism, the practices of imperialism. And then if you go back to, which is I did as part of my work on my new book, look at the New Left 60s rhetoric, monopoly capital and the language of monopoly capital and the analysis of monopoly capital is all over the Third World movement. And so you've got Baran and Sweezy going down to Cuba and meeting with Fidel and meeting with Che and talking about imperialism and drawing on the tradition of Hilferding and the tradition of this early critique, the initial critique at the beginning of the 20th century of imperialism and of the global struggle for colonies and territories and the drive for super exploitation. And I think this analysis still holds, and I think that's one that there's a reason that it got pushed aside, right? There's a reason we were supposed to talk about movies instead of the Korean War, right?
Yeah.
But for some reason, there's a group on the left, I think, who are more interested in Adorno than they are in Che. And I'm not. I'm definitely not in that group of people. And I think there are traditions that put the global class struggle at the center of the analysis of the history of capitalism. And I think financial monopoly capital is one way to do that, that also lets you talk about, Elon Musk and Tesla and what's actually going on in our economy today. Financial monopoly capital, that's what I've been thinking about lately.
Yeah. That seems like it would accommodate to concepts like core versus periphery and north-south distinctions. And it's compatible with certain kinds of analysis that don't involve analyzing cinema, as you say.
I've done mine, thinking about, I guess, what I tried to do in my new book, which I do talk about art and movies a lot. And I keep saying my new book because that's what I've been working on for 2 years. And eventually people will be able to read it. Was trying to think about the world and value production through the cultural products as opposed to the other way around, where you use your understanding of politics and history to try and understand the cultural object. that's less interesting to me than using cultural objects to try and aid your understanding of the history itself.
Yes, the production and the economic context out of which they come.
Which they're good
Yeah.
for.
Yes, that's a refreshing perspective, actually. So kids these days, like I think one more question, two more questions, came out in 2017, which was a long time ago already.
Right?
And in the final chapter, you signpost these 7 things, like nightmares, I guess, that will come to pass if the shitty trends that shape millennials continue. And you identify these as like human capital contracts, the professionalization of childhood, climate privilege, discrimination by algorithm, an expanded carceral system to cope with people who can't cope with the impossible labor market, misogynist resurgence or misogynist backlash, and then growing digital surveillance in a like quotidian way, surveillance capitalism, I guess. So 5 years
It wasn't
later,
quotidian at the time, man.
so how are we doing? And that's that you kind of hint at it there. Like 5 years later, are we
Right. Well, so some of them are more than others. So like
Yeah.
climate privilege is definitely happening.
Yeah.
I think the expanded carceralism is definitely that's when I would like push to the front, is that there have been the attacks on homeless people have really intensified, and the code changes, and they're starting to make it felonies, and the attacks on the camps, and so I think that one is like definitely come to pass. The rise of misogyny, looking back to like the 50s and idealizing the time of the family wage and stuff like that, has definitely happened. The climate crisis is a real thing that exists. Human capital contracts we haven't seen yet. They have not figured that one out, thankfully. I'm not sure when they're going to. It's interesting they sort of bought this stalemate with the repayments freeze.
Oh, yeah.
On student debt, which I sort of didn't see coming, but maybe should have, because it's a very interesting way to like put off the whole problem, to just like freeze everything right now. It's like the debt still exists, but you don't have to pay it. But like maybe you will.
Yeah.
So like I got most of those. I don't know which one were there ones I missed. Which ones did I miss?
No, I mean it seems like we're swimming in this shit. Like I mean 5 years ago, I guess wasn't that long ago, but the dystopian world you were sort of projecting, it feels like we're mostly in it right now. Like you didn't foresee a pandemic, but we're that's basically the only thing that's not on the list that we're subject to currently, which is not great.
Well, it's funny you say that, because when you're writing that kind of book, there's a temptation to like come up with some sort of nice ending, to be like, well, but things are going to be good as soon as we get the workers together. Like you can always join the union. Remember, like, which is true. And so I did get some of that wrong. So one thing I got wrong in that book is like, I don't think there'll be a like millennial union movement, which there is. Although people can argue with the numbers on that one, and we'll see if we get contracts. But I think I was a little too skeptical about whether the traditional labor movement was going to make any sort of progress. So there's one thing I got wrong.
Well, I think a lot of people didn't see that. Like that.
Well, and we'll see what the actual outcome is, because a lot of people within the labor movement will tell you it's like absolute gains are one thing, but relative gains are another, and they're not making relative gains. So you can have some headlines, but unless you're actually getting contracts in shops.
No, that's fair. So last question on kids these days. You have this really powerful quote, and I want you to unpack it if you can. You say, if America is headed for a full-fledged dystopia, it will have gone through us millennials first, and we will have become the first generation of true American fascists. On the other hand, were someone to push American oligarchy off its ledge, the shove seems likely to come from this side of the generation gap, end quote. So obviously a provocative statement, but it kind of prefigured what we ended up debating fascism constantly in the Trump years. And what you're saying there, I think, is true. But I would, if I would like you to elaborate on it, but also, do you think millennials right now are closer to pushing oligarchs off the ledge or becoming the first generation of American fascists?
Man, I think it's really hard because again, I can talk about, and
I see
this is,
both,
you can see, well, you can see how my thought is influenced by Marx at this really fundamental level, because
yeah,
you can think about things as getting better and getting worse, not only at the same time, but through the same mechanisms. And so it's like we have like the left making absolute gains in terms of people's thought, and like there are definitely more people willing to listen to me than there were 10 years ago, I'll tell you that. And like the left had no role in public discourse, almost any, at 10 years ago, and now we've got a much bigger one. And in politics, the idea of Bernie Sanders as a national political figure, never mind the like most popular national political figure, is mind-blowing for someone who was born in the 80s and who's been following politics for 20 plus years, because he is not a popular guy. He is not a mainstream figure. So to watch that change has been crazy. I mean, part of that has been crazy. And at the same time, you can look at history and think like, oh my God, things have gotten so much worse during that same time period. So you can see our like the absolute gains, and you got Occupy, and I know it, the changes in history that you're talking about look like up close, and like it's real, and people can make an actual difference. And at the same time, you see this unrelenting press of the structural relations that just pushing us right towards hell. And the idea, when I wrote that, the idea, if you told me that like, oh yeah, in 2022, like you're totally right. In 2022, there are going to be like fascist organizations that are marching through city downtowns throughout the country. I've been like, whoa, I meant fascist, like, fascist. I didn't mean like fascist. Like,
fucking like, actual.
There's the American Patriot Party wearing fucking skull masks attacking pride shows. Like, I wouldn't have guessed that 3 years ago, So I face this unfortunate position of having been the one on the far end of saying like things are going to get much, much worse. Listen to me, things are getting much, much worse. And then still looking at how things are going and being like, well, I didn't see that coming. I didn't think it was going to get that bad.
Yeah, that's interesting. If we can switch quickly to Palo Alto, there's a few more months before it comes out, I suppose. This is a really ambitious book from what I've seen, like snapshots on Twitter and stuff. And I'm hoping to get a taster and maybe talk about like the tech intersections and the far right. And like, there's a big stew here that gets hopefully disentangled. I'm also incidentally obsessed with California history. So do you have like an elevator pitch for the book? And then is there an origin story for like why this book?
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up there. And so originally I was thinking about it in terms of like, oh, I'll do like a sort of like W.G. Sebald, like Didion, like where I was from, like let me tell you about this place that's so important to the world these days, and I'll talk about some really like evocative stories of my childhood mixed with some facts about Palo Alto and some information. And then the more I researched it, the more I was like, I need to write a history book about this history. Like there's a crazy history here. And the stuff about me or anything about like the personal narrative is just so much less interesting than this historical thread that you can follow that really defines the modern era, right, from 1850 to now. And that you have California as sort of this clasp on the belt of worldwide capital that Marx points out, along with Australia, China, and Japan, as like forming the end of the worldwide achievement of the capital system. From there to 2020, where people think Palo Alto is the center of world capitalism. What does that history look like? Like straight through 1850 to now, from a left-wing Marxist historical understanding, what does it look like? And I start with this epigram from Marx where he's talking about asking for a meaty work on California. Like send me a book about California, because like what's going on there is really important to the history of capitalism. So if you can send me something about California, I'd really appreciate it. To his friends in America, and he never gets it from all appearances, whatever. So in a little bit, I was trying to write this book for Marx to give him the book he never got about California.
That's cool. Wow. Okay, so if you think about Palo Alto and California generally, I mean, one of the things, it's a place, it's a space. Like, this is why I'm so attracted to the history. Like, there's a romanticism in this site, but it's also like really dramatic and really evil all at the same time. Unbelievable exploitation, oppression, expropriation, right? And all of this clashes with the narrative that the place has of itself. Do you think that this like truer history, or the darker history, I guess you could say, of California and Palo Alto, like, do you situate people like Peter Thiel and Michael Anton and like Orange County reactionaries in that history? Is it separate? Is it a separate discussion? Like, do you think this history helps illuminate people like Peter Thiel?
Oh yeah. So Peter Thiel's father is a mining engineer, and he's a mining engineer
already.
So Peter Thiel's dad is a mining engineer, and they live in South Africa. He's a German in South Africa, a supporter of the apartheid regime, who's managing a Namibian uranium mine, trying to get enough uranium for a South African nuclear bomb that would enable them to defend the apartheid system. So that's where Peter Thiel's from.
Jesus Christ.
And you can't understand that history unless you understand the history of mining in South Africa. And you can't understand the history of mining in South Africa unless you understand the history of the California gold rush.
Yeah.
And so it all traces back like it's pretty crazy how it all knits together and how cleanly it does. And you feel like at certain times I felt like I like turn the sweater of history inside out, where you're like seeing all the connections behind the image, and you're like, oh my God, that's how it works. They're mining engineers, of course. And so Herbert Hoover is a central figure in the book, and he's a part of the first class, the pioneer class of Stanford University. He's a freshman in the first class of Stanford University. Becomes president of the United States, obviously, but before that is a mining engineer. He's trained as a mining engineer at Stanford and goes around the world speculating on mines, basically. And the tour of the world that he goes on at the beginning of the 20th century is this amazing confrontation with imperialism. And he's like sending money back to fund Stanford and to fund studies at Stanford the whole time. And so money's coming out of the ground in colonies around the world and coming back to build early Palo Alto through this young mining engineer, Herbert Hoover, including in South Africa, including in China, including in Russia. And so he comes literally face to face with the Boxer uprising.
Oh, wow.
Herbert Hoover's in China as a foreign mining engineer, leading foreign financed expeditions to look for, I think, coal at that point. The role that Chinese coal plays in history is a whole other story, but that's definitely part of the story, is Herbert Hoover going to find it on behalf of financiers throughout Europe. And so like it seems like so long ago, but it's not. It's really this modern era that's 100 years old or whatever, 150 years old, that is the subject of this book. And that's the capitalist era, and Palo Alto's at really the center of it the whole time. So definitely people like Peter Thiel are the figurative and sometimes the literal sons of these figures, right? So one of Hoover's associates is the first Draper. And so we've still got Draper VCs in California, fifth generation, major figures in California politics the whole time, but personal associates of Herbert Hoover. Same with the Bechtels, right? So these are like And it goes way weirder. It's stuff in the Philippines gets super crazy. There's like a whole bunch of Japanese war gold that ends up in Palo Alto. So I'm really excited for people to get it. But it really is. The subtitle is "The History of California, Capitalism, and the World." And so when I mean the world, I really do mean the world, because this is the birth of the world system, and California is at the end, but the end is the beginning, right?
Yeah. No, I was going to say it's like it's a site within the world system, and that's probably like the best way to understand it, certainly in a historical sense. And it sounds like that's exactly what you're saying. God dang, dude, I can't wait for this book. It sounds fucking awesome.
It's right here. So if I could pass it through the screen, I'd give you one.
I freaking wish, man. That's awesome. What's the actual date when it comes out?
It comes out 2/14/23, Valentine's Day, 2014.
Beautiful Valentine's Day book.
Yeah, right. A present for your sweetheart.
There we go.
We can get you one before then, I'm sure.
Oh, I hope so, man. Okay, I have two more questions. They're sort of tangents off the book because I haven't obviously read the book yet. What are your thoughts? There is in left spaces, especially right now, there's lots of vibey discussions about the new right, all post liberal, whatever the fuck you want to call it. These like this aesthetically edgy MAGA right. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So I have a sense of where you're going with this, and I like it. Peter Thiel's bankrolling these fuckers. There's a fake New York art scene around some of this shit. How do you make sense of the new right? What are they up to? What should the left think of? What should the left and or correct thinking people make of it?
I think it's interesting to think back to the counter-insurgency movement against the new left in the 60s and early 70s. And so you have and it's a story I tell in the book, and maybe it's because I'm thinking about the book that I talk about it. But Peter Thiel particularly is very much part of this tradition, like directly, right? So he comes out of this right-wing milieu at Stanford.
Reacting against the new left
to expand it and be really the like core now of what is the right-wing milieu at Stanford. But before him, it was the YAF, which was this right-wing student organization formed by, I think, the Buckleys, but that had chapters around the country. That was basically a counterinsurgency operation. And the role they play, especially at Stanford, is directly counterinsurgency, which is they went out and they were trying to, with fists and sometimes with guns, fight the new left. Like, right? They said, like, all right, if the liberal rules are off, if the left is not respecting the rules of liberalism, then we're not going to either. And if they're going to disrupt things, then we're going to disrupt things. And if they're not going to play by the law, then we're not going to play by the law. And decided that they would sort of fight directly against the new left, and were supported in doing so by the administrations of schools, for example, by the right-wing philanthropic complex. And so Thiel doesn't look, that's not like his relation to that isn't metaphoric or whatever, it's direct, right? He comes out of and is born during this period and comes out of this milieu that emerged and cut its teeth on counterinsurgency operations against the left. And he can draw his legacy back to Hoover and fear at the Bolshevik Revolution, which he, knew those guys. Like he knew Hoover knew people who got killed by the Bolsheviks because they were working on mining projects together. And when the workers rose up, they didn't like the Romanov baron that he was best buddies with. And so a lot of it's ultimately about decolonization, and so what the right was responding to in the 70s and 80s is still the right now, right? You still have the right now. What the right was doing in the 70s and 80s is what the right was still doing in the 30s. And so you have this real, I think, continuity over this whole capitalist era. And so I don't see what they're doing as any different than the youth counterinsurgency work that's been done in the past that the right has been very, very eager to fund. It's
not a new configuration. It's just new branding.
I don't think so at all. And the fact that they're like, oh, we like workers or whatever. It's like, I don't think that's serious. Yeah, it's like, and it's the same thing that I talked about in kids these days, which is like, yeah, you like the era of the family wage, which doesn't, which like was correlated with higher average wages for some people. That's true. If
Certain
you don't,
kind of person.
if you don't think about women as people, like it's true.
Yeah.
And was like, yeah, it's like wages per person of the household were higher. Like that's true. Also, women like couldn't own property, so
Yeah.
nostalgia for that time and for the family wage, I think, is really pernicious. And I've said so from before they started having it. It was predictable.
Yeah.
And I think Melinda Cooper's book on family values, what's called family values, and like the relation between neoliberal and the human capital stuff we were talking about earlier, and the family in terms of actual practicality is really good. Which is that the family is an ally of these changes, not an enemy of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole like Ford, I think I wrote this somewhere recently, like the whole Fordist like political economy in which like the white lunch pail working man on the assembly line kind of thing, like that form of political economy was only possible within a unique historical moment where you had the wife at home holding down a whole lot of like uncompensated labor to make the system work like that.
Well, and it had to do with massacring tin miners in Bolivia. It's
But
like,
yes, there's a global
so it's like
context.
there's a whole like global system of production that's based
Internal
on
and external, yeah.
differentiated wages, and so it's like the idea that you can go back. It's unserious, and that's not surprising, whatever, because that's not their real politics, and that's no one's real politics is to go back to what? It's like they hated the New Deal, like.
Yes. So you can find this reactionary through line in the new right, the Peter Thiel new right is like just a continuation of it. Is that?
I genuinely worry about clarifying their thought for them in this book, because I think it can do a lot to explain what they're actually doing. And they'll have to look at a lot of it and be like, oh yeah, that is what we're doing. We are. It really is about like democracy in South Africa.
Oh my God. Yeah. Well, all the more reason to want this book. I have one last question that I probably should have asked you like at the beginning. But Eric Olenwright, I think he died recently, but he had this book called Envisioning Real Utopias, I think. And he laid out 3 strategies for the left for how to realize a real utopia. And he called them like ruptural, interstitial, and symbiotic. And these categories are kind of like too like broad and underspecified to be a actual basis for strategy in my view, but they do kind of describe 3 different theories of change. And so like ruptural, that you probably already know this, but ruptural, just for the audience, rupturalists are like no shit revolutionaries, right? And you got to be able to do violence on behalf of the cause. Interstitialists are looking to build sort of like left or progressive ecosystems outside the realm of state power, like where state is not exercising its authority or control. So maybe it's has an anarchical sensibility. And then the symbiotic crowd is basically social democrats, so people trying to push progressive change through the instrument of the state. How would you situate yourself in these categories? And then which like approach or combination of approaches do you think the historical moment demands from us?
Well, I think that you can think about it 2 ways. I'm gonna like do some hedging and then give my like anyone who knows me knows there are some really easy answers. Sure. You can think about it 2 ways, and I think it's important to think about it 2 ways, which is that you've got it in terms of analysis and then also temperament. Is that you can have someone who's got moderate temperament, whose role in any like given situation is going to be to try and like figure compromise out or whatever, but who have a revolutionary understanding of the moment. And I know lots of people who are like that, right? Myself, I'm a revolutionary communist, and that's both in terms of my analysis of the situation and in terms of my.
That's wild. I actually didn't know that. For all that I've read from you, I did not know that.
Well, you're not supposed to say it, right?
Yeah.
But like when you talk about my political development or whatever, and when I started thinking about serious ideas, not to get into nominalism or whatever, but I started listening to Malcolm X speeches. And one thing that he's very clear of, and that I always found, then later when I read Marx or I read Rosa Luxemburg or I read any number of people, or I read Che or whatever, found that there's no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. Revolution is revolution. It's a serious thing and it's not a joke. And that most of the world understands that because they've encountered it. And America has a strange history with regard to revolution that we have a hard time. We think about it as great lip gloss branding, but as a unimaginable event. Whereas a lot of people throughout the world have seen maybe 3 or 4 revolutions in their lifetime. It's far from impossible. But revolution is bloodshed over land. That's what Malcolm X says, and that's, I think, the historical reality. And if I thought that the people who ran the system or the system itself were capable of coming to some kind of compromise, of restraining the system that they ostensibly direct, then my analysis would be different. But I do believe that capitalism is an uncontrollable system and that it's an exhausting, destructive system and an accelerating one. And I do believe it has crisis tendencies that tend to overwhelm its counteracting anti-crisis tendencies. And so I don't think it's a stable system. Even as it tries to repair itself, it continues to destroy. And we're looking at a system that in less than 200 years as a world system has closing in on destroying the habitability of much of the earth on a day-to-day basis. So I can only look at that and be a revolutionary.
So identifying as a revolutionary and so a rupturalist in the like Eric Oldenwright sense, does that mean but you still vote, right? I mean, like, so like, so I guess maybe as like a defensive tactic or something, but you don't believe that
it's really easy to vote.
The state, well, that's true. As long as you have an ID.
Right.
So
depending on who you are and where you are, it's really easy.
Yeah. With all kinds of caveats. But so you don't think that, so it's one thing to be like post-capitalist. I'm trying to like hone in here. It's one thing to be post-capitalist. It's another thing to be like anti-statist, or to think that like you need to capture the state on some level in order to achieve. So do you have a feeling about the means of revolution, I guess? So you have a revolutionary end state that you're trying to get to. That would be a more clarifying.
Well, I think C.L.R. James said that the ruling class is only defeated when running for their lives, and I think that's true.
Holy shit, man!
I mean, it's like look, everyone running around calling themselves Marxists. You got to read what Marx wrote, right? And same thing, and that's exactly what Malcolm X was saying when he said, I can't exactly say it in the terms that he said it in, but he said, people running around talking about revolution, you don't want to see revolution. Like, you want to talk about revolution, be serious about talking about revolution. Like, revolution is not a like things change and everyone's happy, whatever. You got to hope for the least destructive transition you can talk about. But you talk about a more violent situation than now. I mean, like, you look at what the next decade is going to require of Americans in terms of the kind of death they're going to have to be complicit in and ignore. Like, it's not a question, for me, it's not a question of like violence or no violence or whatever. It's about whether you're willing to take responsibility for the world that you're part of or not.
Yeah, no, there's like a security or violence for whom question too underlying all of this, because it's gonna, unless there's some sort of radical change, there's going to be insecurity. Like, we're living on an ongoing basis with like a deep kind of insecurity, but it's not felt by certain groups of people
until it is, and you don't have a lot of warning necessarily. I'm from California, and those fires move quick.
No, that's true.
And that's what Mike Davis was saying, right? And that's what Mike Davis has been saying for a long, long time. And that's another guy that you can look to as
30 years before it was cool.
Revolutionary thing. But part of his analysis has always been that like this is serious, that this is an uncontrollable system with a crisis tendency, and you're not going to get out of this by coming to an agreement with capital, and that the fire is coming.
So like I mean everyone who listens to the show knows like I'm not a revolutionary and I don't identify as a Marxist, even though I embrace certain forms of that analysis. There's a question here about like you were sort of very critical of the new right and the fascists because they're fucking fascists, right? Like you don't see a kind of like red-brown alliance as the path for democracy or for the left. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I don't even recognize half of those terms. Yeah, right. It's like those people will kill me as soon as look at me. Like they know who I am and I know who they are, and no one's confused.
So yeah, so you know your enemy. That's good. But that's a constraint on me. So like you basically like if you're someone on the edgy left, which is not you, you flirt with
edgy enough. I just said we need to.
I know.
Jeez,
it's an aesthetic.
What's a guy got to do to be edgy these days? Be a fucking fascist? Revolution. Since when is fascism edgier than communist revolution? What kind of world we live in?
Fair. I mean, like you know what I mean. The aesthetic edgy groups, like there's
the Christian God, like Jesus, like that's who's
edgy. There's a cross section of the left that's like kind of fringy that does fuck with the right, that does fuck with the far, like not even like center right, but like the Peter Thiel right, and like that is the basis for this Compact Magazine stuff. That's the basis for like a kind of red brownism. Is their mind fucked up? What's their deal? I mean, like,
it's hard, and I wish I could just dismiss it. But when I look at their like publication list or whatever, and I see people that we published at the New Inquiry, and I see people who were leftists who position themselves on the left, it's hard. It feels like a loss in some ways, not in terms of a like emotional loss, but in terms of a like material loss. Like we're in trouble. The left is in trouble. I think that's hard to deny, and I think they're taking advantage of that situation. And yeah, some people's brains are fucking fried. Some people are opportunists. Some people are cowards. Some people did too many drugs. You know, like I think that's like literally you can hurt your brain. Like you can do too many drugs that your ability to reason is damaged, and that happens to people, and it's really sad.
Yeah.
And I think that a number of the people involved in that project are probably, if you like sat down and had a conversation with them for a half an hour, it would be clear to you that this is not someone who's like reason is to be relied upon. But that's not what they're there for, right? They're there to make like id type arguments, right? To say the things that like are not reasoned, that come from some place that is less than that.
Be contrarian or something, yeah.
Or worse, like just like, you know, to give into the conventional hatreds, you know.
Yeah.
Talk about the least edgy things in the world, right? Like transphobia is the least edgy thing you can possibly imagine. Like get back, queer bashing is like the, you know, maybe I'm old, but like nothing less edgy than queer bashing.
Yeah, this idea that like you would either marginalize or ignore like the LGBTQ community, I cannot fashion a way of thinking that you would identify as like left or progressive that would say we carve out this community as something we can put on the ice floe and like forsake or something. Like it doesn't wash with me.
And I'm not a psychologist, and that's not my background, but there are a fair number of people on the left are, and I think they've got probably some insightful senses of where these people are coming from, because I think it's somewhere off in psychology land and not from the realm of analysis.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, dude, this conversation got radical at the end. Holy shit.
That's what it should.
But I've loved the journey. I really appreciate you sitting down, getting Kids These Days on wax here for the audience. And then Palo Alto is going to be fucking mind melting. I can't wait for this.
You got to have me back, man.
Yeah. Maybe we'll do a deep dive after I've read it. Shit. Very, very excited. Thanks for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. I'm gonna hit stop record now, I guess. I don't know if it's gonna cut us off. It's been a couple weeks since I did an episode. All right. This has been awesome, though. Thank you.
No, thanks so much for having me.